Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on the geopolitics of the Green Deal. It's great to have you here with us today. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel. And I'm very pleased to host this event today together with our colleagues from the European Council on Foreign Relations, with whom we have actually written a paper and launched that paper today. And the paper is eponymous, so it's called also The Geopolitics of the Green Deal. The authors of the paper are Mark Leonard, Jeremy Shapiro from the European Council of Foreign Relations, as well as Simone Tagliapietra, Jean Pisani-Ferry, and myself from Bruegel. And the idea we had really almost a year ago was to write a paper, write a note, which discusses what the biggest and most important initiative of the European Union, namely the greening of its own economy and society by 2050, meaning the full decarbonization of its economy by 2050, what that means for the globe and what it means for our neighboring countries, as well as global partners, global competitors across the world. And when we started doing that research, we very quickly realized that many aspects that mostly are discussed from a domestic point of view, such as taxing CO2 emissions, pushing industrial policy, ensuring that we accelerate the greening of our economy until 2030, that many of these aspects do not only have major implications for our domestic economies, our domestic activity, but they also have implications for neighbors and for the world. And so with that spirit in mind, we thought it's an excellent idea to team up between political scientists, international relations specialists, and economists. And the resulting paper was published today and is available on the websites of our two institutions. So what we would like to do today is have a discussion, first present the paper. The paper will be presented by two of the authors, and I will give first the floor to Simone Tagliapietra and then to Mark Leonard, the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And then we want to engage in a discussion with our guests that have read the paper and will want to comment on the paper. And let me welcome Stefano Grassi, who is the head of cabinet in the European Commission, responsible for the energy and also, I think, the energy transition, the climate transition. So really the Commissioner for Energy,
Okay, we might have lost the connection from Guntram, but the presentation was to Stefano Grassi, head of cabinet of Commissioner Simpson, Mark van Heukelen, EU ambassador at large for climate action, and Jennifer Tolman, senior fellow at E3G. So in absence of the chair, I would simply give myself the word in order to present the paper, and then Guntram will certainly rejoin us in a second. So let me share with you these slides in order to really share with you the main messages of a paper that we have been working on for 1 year. I mean, this work started in February last year. It has been really a work that has accompanied us during also the months of the lockdowns in our respective countries, etc. But really, this has been an intellectual adventure that, as Guntram was saying, brought together economics and international relation expertise. And we really tried to team up in view of mapping out what really is still an unexplored territory, because we know very well now the various dimensions of the European Green Deal domestically. We know the various climate policies that are embedded in the European Green Deal, etc. But this foreign policy dimension, this geopolitical dimension of the European Green Deal still really needs to be developed also at the policy level. So with this paper, what we really want to do is to first understand intellectually and really from a theoretical perspective also, what are the channels through which the geopolitical repercussions of the European Green Deal can be exercised in the future. And then we made an effort to understand how key players such as Russia, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and China might react to the European Green Deal. And finally, we really try to formulate a foreign policy agenda for the European Green Deal, which should, in our hope, serve the internal thinking also in the EU institutions with this regard. So let me start by saying that the European Green Deal is an effort to really redefine the European economy in general, but in particular, it is an effort to really reshape the way energy is produced and consumed in Europe. We know that 3/4 of the EU energy system today relies on fossil fuels. This situation will have to be completely upturned by 2050 if we are to achieve the objectives of the European Green Deal. Here you see our elaboration on the data of the European Commission regarding the impact assessment of the 2050 climate neutrality target. And you see how the energy mix of Europe will assist over the next decades a major shift from coal, oil, and gas to renewable energy. And of course, also with a persistent role of nuclear into the mix. But really, the idea is that over the next decade already, our utilization of oil and gas and coal primarily will decline, but the sharp decrease will occur after 2030. And this also has important implications in terms of imports of energy, of course, because as you know, Europe has to import most of the oil and the gas it consumes. And as you can see from these projections, always based on the Commission data, after 2030 in particular, the EU requirements for oil and gas imports will dramatically decline. Now, all this will inevitably have profound impacts on the EU neighborhood and on the global energy system overall. We identify 4 channels through which the European Green Deal can have its geopolitical implication. The first channel is the repercussions of all these trends on oil and gas producing countries in the neighborhood. The second channel is the repercussion for the European energy security. The third channel is repercussions on global energy markets. And finally, repercussions on global trade, most notably through the carbon border adjustment measures that the European Commission intends to introduce in the framework of the European Green Deal. Now, what about the neighborhood? So let me review quickly these 4 channels we identified. Here, the issue is that in the neighborhood, and really also in an enlarged concept, also embracing Central Asia, Africa, etc., we know that there are certain countries that are highly dependent internally on the oil rent. Think about Algeria, think for the gas, notably the gas rent, think about Libya, think about Russia, think about Azerbaijan, etc. There are countries that are highly dependent on the oil and gas rent, and on top of that, they are highly dependent on Europe as an export market. So if you look at Libya, for example, 90% of the fossil fuel export goes to Europe. In Azerbaijan, 90% of the export goes to Europe, and so on and so forth. So a major restructuring of the European energy system will have an impact on these countries. And this impact will be particularly important after 2030 as the EU imports of oil and gas will decrease. If you look at the oil situation, there will be countries that will be affected more than others. For example, Nigeria is a country that has a very high break-even oil price, around $80 per barrel, while Saudi Arabia has a much lower break-even price, and therefore Saudi Arabia is likely to feel the hit of the European Green Deal perhaps later on than a country like Nigeria or even Russia that have higher break-even oil prices. The second channel is the repercussions for the European energy security. We know that traditionally, energy security in Europe has been about security of oil and gas supplies, and most particularly gas supplies from Russia. That has been the major European energy security concern traditionally. With the European Green Deal, these risks will progressively disappear as the imports of oil and gas will decrease. But at the same time, the European Green Deal will also pave the way for new energy security risks to arise. One is the prospects of the imports of green electricity, so renewable electricity and green hydrogen from, again, countries in North Africa rather than Ukraine and other countries in the Eastern neighborhood. The second risk that has to be managed is the increased imports of those minerals and metals that are really underpinning green technologies. And here, the potential risk that is often marked in the debate is a potential shift of EU dependency currently on Russia for gas and also for oil to a dependency, for example, on China for the supply of critical raw materials for the energy transition. The third channel relates to global oil markets in general, so not just the neighborhood now. Europe represents 25% of the global oil market. Should Europe progressively consume less and less oil, and particularly after 2030, these might well have a depressing effect on global oil price. Again, these will have major implications for oil producers. Just think about what happened last year during the peak of the pandemic for the situation of oil producers such as Saudi Arabia. When oil price went down to a level of $30 and $40 per barrel, after a year of that, Saudi Arabia budget deficit reached 12% of GDP, a condition that was really unprecedented for the country. So that kind of situation might progressively become structural, and this, as we will see later on, really calls for economic diversification in these oil-producing countries. The fourth channel concerns carbon border adjustment. So overall, the impact on global trade of the European Green Deal. The EU imports carbon-intensive goods from a different array of countries. So if you look at steel, for example, we import a lot of steel from Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, aluminium from Norway, China, Russia, carbon black from Russia, the US, Ukraine, etc. So there are different countries here that might be affected by the introduction of a carbon border adjustment on carbon-intensive goods. Now, there is a wide debate on this issue. The Commission will come up in the spring with a proposal on carbon border adjustment. We think at Bruegel, we have done different research on this issue. New research will be also coming up soon. CBAM can be designed in a way to be WTO compliant. The key issue here is geopolitics. Carbon border adjustment would have been perhaps very difficult if Trump were to remain in the White House. Now the situation is different because we know that also President Biden has pledged during the campaign to introduce carbon border adjustment measures in the United States in certain sectors. And therefore, we can think about a joint introduction of EU-US carbon border adjustment measures. Here, it will be key to think about exemptions for developing countries, of course, not to disfavor them in the process. And this might really be an important tool to also foster the decarbonization process and pledges of countries like China that will certainly be much interested in avoiding being subjected to carbon border adjustment by being part of a sort of climate club. So these are the 4 channels that we identified, and I will give the word to Mark to give you an idea about the foreign policy action plan we envisage for the European Green Deal. Mark.
Great. Thank you very much, Simone. Thank you, Guntram. It's been an absolute pleasure working with Bruegel again on this project. We had a really exciting collaboration last year on economic sovereignty and what that meant in a European context. And it's been even more exciting to carry on the cooperation around climate, because I think what you see very clearly from Simone's slides is how dramatically the Green New Deal changes our relationship, not just with our immediate neighbours, but with a lot of the great powers which we are going to have to deal with in the future. And I think that there is a sort of perennial challenge for EU foreign policy making, which is that we are so focused on dealing with the internal dynamics within the EU and making sure that we can get agreement with between different players within the EU, that we often neglect what the geopolitical externalities are going to be. We saw this with GDPR, which was a really important move of European leadership, which changed the way that markets worked on the global stage, and very little thought was given to what some of the external manifestations of the so-called Brussels effects might be. And I think on this we could see much more dramatic implications still. And unless we anticipate some of the pushbacks and do outreach to other players before we bring these policies in, we could actually find ourselves stymied, both being less effective than we want to be to save the planet, but also accidentally stumbling into all sorts of problems, whether it's trade wars, whether it's diplomatic fallback, or an increase in instability in our neighborhood, which we have to pay for in other ways. And that's why this project has been, I think, so interesting and so important, because if the EU aspires to global leadership on these issues, we do need to start thinking about what some of the external implications of our work may be. Personally, I take, as a father of young children, take inspiration from one of the great thinkers about geopolitical implications, who is Hopper, who's the ruthless leader of the Grasshopper Gang in the Hollywood animation of Bug's Life. And he explains that the first rule of leadership is that everything is your fault. I think what we're trying to do here is to map out what kinds of mitigating actions we can take on 2 tracks. First track is more of a defensive track, and it's looking at how to ensure that the implications of the Green New Deal are not too negative for our neighbours, for other countries, to make sure that they don't blow it up and that they don't push back against what we're trying to do. And the second track is a more positive one, which is based on a recognition that the EU only accounts for 10% of global carbon emissions, which means that EU action isn't going to solve the climate emergency unless it catalyzes action from others, and that's has to be an important part of what we do. So we have 8 different steps as part of this foreign policy plan, which I'll talk you through at the moment. I'll start with this first track. So the first step is about helping energy exporters in the European neighbourhood in the way that that Simone was talking about. If you look at the figures which he showed before, you can see the devastating impact that this could have on countries like Algeria. And an important part of this is to help them think about how they go about diversifying their economic base. We can, for example, in many of these countries like Algeria, look at promoting solar energy or hydrogen markets or other kinds of issues. And the idea is to have tailor-made plans for each individual partner country. That brings me to the second step, which is to think about improving the supply of critical raw materials. Simone talked about how we risk trading one set of dependencies out of the hydrocarbon era for another set, and rare earths is one of the most common choke points when it comes to thinking about how we move to a battery-centric economy. And there are ideas both about how to diversify our supplies, but also to think about recycling and substitution. The third step is about the carbon adjustment mechanism. I think that the case for having a mechanism is overwhelming. We don't want European manufacturers either to be disadvantaged when they are competing with other players who are subject to less stringent regulations than we are, but also there's no point in undertaking a Green New Deal if we're simply displacing carbon use to other parts of the world. So it is essential to deal with the carbon leakage problem. But at the same time, if this is introduced in the wrong way, it could lead to problems in the WTO. We could have trade wars, we could have geopolitical turmoil with our biggest economic partners. And the paper looks at some of the ways of working through the WTO within the framework of the Paris Agreement to minimize the pushback on that front. But I think the most important thing for us is what Simone was talking about, which is the need to work closely with the Biden administration and to see whether we could adopt similar mechanisms with the US, which could create a climate club that other countries such as China might aspire to join if they meet environmental standards. And we have an enormous amount of leverage if we bring together the EU and the US economies on that. The other track is really to think about this more positive agenda. How do we tool up the EU so that we can be a foreign policy leader, so that we're not just a green continent in a very brown world? And there, the kind of central piece of this is to think about how we can become a global reference and standard center for energy transition and build coalitions around it. And there are various different dimensions to that. This slide has got some of the key ways, using the Brussels effect with this huge market, thinking about trying to become the standard setter for a nascent hydrogen market, but also green bonds is an area which could unleash a huge amount of capital for this transition, and the EU has a substantial share of this new market, which is going to need a lot of standardization. The fifth step is thinking about the instruments that the EU can use to export the Green New Deal through the MFF and the Next Generation EU. We have about 600 billion euros of fresh EU money for the green transition. And in the paper, we argue that we should spend about 10% of that, about 60 billion, on helping neighboring countries make that transition. And this can obviously be supplemented with a substantial amount of money, which is already allocated to EU development policy, where climate needs to be mainstreamed alongside other priorities. And the sixth dimension is thinking about what coalitions we could build around this. We look in the paper at two particular types of transitions. So the sixth one is thinking about a coalition for permafrost, where the EU tries to bring together a set of countries that can fund measures to contain the permafrost thaw, looking at restoring grassland, reducing forests and large animal herd grazing. The seventh step is thinking about another coalition for climate change mitigation, which is looking at how we can use trade, development, and financial policy to bring countries together, as well as companies and international organizations that want to invest in afforestation and reforestation activities around the world, as well as R&D and demonstration projects to show how technology can be part of the solution. And that brings us to the final step, which is thinking about whether the EU can use all of this to promote a sort of global platform on the new economics of climate action. There's a successful story which comes from our experience with the EU carbon market, where we cooperated with other partners such as China. And as think tankers, we believe very strongly that we should treat this as a laboratory for policy innovation and see how, as well as using hard power, regulation and money to get people to think differently about these issues, we can also let the power of ideas infect the way that other people around the world think about these issues and share good practice.
Thanks a lot, Mark, and thanks a lot, Simone. And again, a very warm welcome to our guests. I actually welcomed you, continue to welcome you, and I understand now that I was cut off right after Stefano's after I introduced Stefano. So my apologies. The Zoom crashed completely here on my side. So thanks for joining us. And now you've heard a big presentation, a very long presentation, and we would love to hear, of course, your reactions to what you just heard. And we also, of course, let me remind our audience, want to hear from our audience questions. Go on Slido and type in the code geopolitics, and then I will see those questions and be able to ask them. But let me turn to you, Stefano, a few reactions from your side. Perhaps especially on the issue of energy transition and the opportunities it gives for international cooperation.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Guntram, for having me here and giving me this opportunity to exchange on this very topical paper. And first of all, congratulations to Mark, Simone, and all the other authors. I found the paper very well done, very structured, and brings a lot of clarity on a complex debate, which is now moving from the periphery to the center of the discussion around the Green Deal. But what I found particularly intriguing is that the paper points to a reality which is now very present on our thinking and on our daily action. And that is that the global energy system is in a period of very fast and very intense change. And this change is not only benign, it's not something which only holds the promise of a better, cleaner, or a greener world, but it's something very disruptive. And it will imply, as you say in the paper, shifts in trade flows, will redefine the relative positions of many actors, will probably shake up a number of partnerships and redefine a number of alliances. And as the Green Deal, we are part of this new clean energy world, and we are realizing that it might be not as consensual or cooperative or based on structure of collaboration as we would like, but it will probably be a world of very competitive, very fragmented, and possibly also conflictual. And this should not be a surprise for anyone, because the global system in which we are embedded as the energy system is in itself now getting more and more multipolar, more fragmented, and possibly even at risk of conflict, because we lack an adequate governance. Now, I have to say that this awareness of this changing context and all its complexity was possibly not really so present when we started 1.5 years ago to discuss the Green Deal. And I think, as Simone was saying in the beginning, the domestic implications were much more to the fore and much more present in when we were defining the strategy. And if you look at the international section of a Green Deal communication, it is a small one and is more about climate cooperation, CBAM, etc. But progressively, this dimension has become more and more important. I think we are more aware of this. The question is now what we do with that, and do we have the tools to support this awareness and to have an effective action? And I would just wanted to make 3 quick points commenting on your paper. The first is that I see now the risk of isolation for the European Union less present or less concerning than I could feel and we could feel from our angle here at the beginning of last year. I think it's the concept that Mark was referring, a green fortress in a brown world, which will be a very fragile position. I think we have seen now the change in the United States. We have seen a string of commitments to net zero or to climate neutrality, maybe with different timelines, from very important partners. And I remember how isolated we were in the first G20 meeting under the Saudi Arabian presidency at the beginning of the G20, when there was this agreement on the supply of oil and the control of supply of oil between Russia, US, and Saudi Arabia. which was brought to the G20, and we were possibly the only one bringing out the dimension of the Green Deal. I think now also the risk of potential tensions with the US is there, the paper says, and there are also other dimensions. But I think we are now in a more comfortable position to manage these tensions, to manage and to find allies and cooperation than we were probably 1 year ago. The important thing to remember is that we will never be a green fortress. You gave the data on our trade balance, import and export of energy. But even in the future, even when we will have a renewable electricity system based with 60 or 80% of renewables, we will never be energy independent. We will always be at the center of a flow of import and export relations, and we must be very aware of that. Second point is that I see really the epicenter of all this discussion, our neighborhood. It's important to discuss India, China, Russia, United States. But I think where all the tensions of the Green Deal are converging is our neighborhood, east and south. And we see in the regions a mix of reactions. Some there is concern, as you say, those who have the challenge of diversification, they see their export challenge. But we see also interest for the opportunities for developing a renewable powered economy, opportunities for exporting, possibly in the future hydrogen to Europe. So it's a mix of reaction, but I think it's an area where first the trade flows, second the impact of a CBAM, if you look at who is exporting steel, cement and other, is really where the tensions will be converged. How we manage this? We have last year presented the Western Balkans investment plan with a strong energy dimension component. We will in 1 week present the Southern Neighborhood strategy. But there are 2 points that I wanted to stress. One is very important, the idea of a tailor-made partnership. This is an area, both areas, the regional strategies are not always the most effective. And the second one, we need to become a bit more pragmatic when we approach those countries. We need to understand they have different starting points, they have different trajectories. If we go there, we talk about generalities, targets, climate action, and we don't neither give them the instruments to organize their own transition. And if we do not very pragmatically understand that they might need to have transitional or bridge solutions before moving to neutrality, I think we will just leave the space to someone else. The asset we have there is our tools for the just transition. Final point from my side, a lot of the future competition on the energy system will not be about the access to resources, will be about the access to technologies. And the economy of the renewable energy is a lot about investing is a lot about the installations, the upfront cost of creating new power generation installation is the infrastructure and the grids. But then the operation, you have zero cost. Wind and solar, it's a free resource. So we have a window of opportunity now to get into this new competition, to get access to these new markets. And we have new leadership in offshore and hydrogen in a number of those technologies. So I think energy external policy must be a projection of our industrial policy. If you read our offshore renewable energy strategy and our hydrogen strategy, there is a lot there. Level playing field, keeping a non-discriminatory access to markets, and we need that is also transatlantic relation to be monitored, and a lot about access to raw materials, critical materials. And final point, a lot will be about the race to define global standards, because that will define which technologies are used. Those are the points I want to make, but most of all, congratulations for a very good paper.
Well, thank you so much, Stefano, for the praise and also for the very important points you made. And I think also the last point really on the industrial policy strategy is a very important and very interesting one, because we are indeed leaders in some of those technologies. And one of the big discussions we've had in this, but also in other projects, has been exactly around the question, how can we ensure that the technologies that we develop also in the end lead to commercial applications that create jobs here in Europe. And of course, the example of the solar industry is perhaps less encouraging than the one of the wind energy. So I think that's a fascinating debate with major implications, of course, for Europe's economy in the world. But let me turn to Jennifer next for her comments, and then to Mark van Heukelen. Jennifer, you're muted. Yeah, perfect.
Yes, thank you very much. I would also really like to congratulate you on this timely report. This is really clearly in the debate now, and this is the time to be laying down this proactive foreign policy agenda. And I think there are some very strong elements in this report that are already part of the debate and could inspire further debate. I'd like to focus on 4 points that I really agree with. 3 points that I would really welcome further exploration on, and 1 question that I would like to put to you as report authors, but also to the other panelists. Now, in terms of the points that I really agree on, the first piece is this needs to be a proactive foreign policy agenda, and that means really looking not just at energy diplomacy, which is, I think, a lot of what this report does very, very well, but also the things that this report starts hinting at, which is the development policy that needs to underpin that, and the broader investment strategies that need to underpin that, including external dimensions of industrial policy, as Stefano mentioned. I also really agree with the geopolitical risk of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. That is a huge thing that we're seeing right now, and I think proactive engagement is exactly what we need. The one thing that I would note on that I'm not sure the report digs into as much is, depending on what method of carbon border adjustment mechanism the EU is choosing come June or proposing come June, the approach is actually a lot more aligned with China than it is with the US, and that comes down to differing approaches to carbon pricing. So the simple fact that the US, at least as we see it and as our Washington colleagues see it, is not currently anywhere near agreeing a national level carbon price actually really complicates the sequencing of this sort of engagement, because it means you really need to be engaging the US and the transatlantic dynamic before you even put forward a proposal, or risk the proposal actually being more aligned with Chinese efforts than with US efforts. So I think that's something to dig into a bit further, but a point very well made. I also think more broadly, the way that the report puts forward the EU as a global standard setter, and that being a real diplomatic lever and geopolitical lever increasingly, is very apt and very timely. That is exactly what we're seeing also in some of the conclusions that came out of the meeting of the 27 foreign affairs ministers at the end of January. And I think this really needs to be taken forward. The final piece that I really agree with is the risk around Russia. And I actually think we could go even further. I think as the foreign affairs ministers actually recognized in their conclusions, there is a risk of misinformation around energy transition. And I would actually even go further than that. What is the active disruption agenda that could be driven if the Green Deal is looking to be succeeding? Because right now, if you are threatened by climate action, as Russia is, you know that you can't stop it, but you can delay it. And what is the delay tactic that we need to be on the lookout for as a key geopolitical risk management strategy? Now, in terms of the 3 pieces that I would really welcome further exploration, I think one is, what do we do to support others' transitions? I think the report really aptly identifies that we need to, but my question is, what does that look like? What is our toolbox here? And I think there's already some very strong work out there on that, but also how do things like a carbon border adjustment mechanism maybe come into that? Is part of the resources that comes out of something like that going back into supporting other countries, more developing countries, with their own transition? How are we coupling this back to the cooperation offer? And here I'm particularly looking at North Africa, more broadly the MENA region, but also how are we dealing with Egypt? That is a really key player that I don't feel like we've dug into yet. The second big point is how the European Green Deal interacts with the geopolitics of climate change, not the geopolitics of the Green Deal. And by this, I really mean the issue of climate security, the issue of climate as the threat multiplier, and the learnings that we're getting from the Green Deal in terms of resilience and incentivizing investment in resilience. How are we taking this forward through the EU's development policy as not just a role model of how we do our Green Deal, but to co-develop how we can incentivize investment in other countries? And I think that's going to be a huge geopolitical issue of the next 2 years, as we see either a decade of development or a decade of lost development, so sustainable development or lost development. And then the final piece that I would really welcome as strong a report on kind of 1 year on, I'd love to be in a panel on this in 1 year's time, is what is the big picture opportunity here beyond standard setting on the energy transition? how is the Green Deal the regulatory reference point, the regulatory kind of legitimacy to build a geopolitical coalition around a rules-based trade and investment system for clean economy? So by this, I mean, how are we leveraging the EU's sustainable investment taxonomy? So sustainable finance taxonomy, the thing that decides what is considered sustainable investment or not. How are we leveraging the product standards that we're starting to see emerge beyond the energy sector? I think that would be really exciting. And there's actually a lot of potential there, given the fact that the G7 is soon to be a net zero club. And then one final question for everybody. Who leads on this? What is the team within Europe whose responsibility a geopolitical projection of the Green Deal is? And I think all of us have views on that, but I'd really like to hear them. Thank you.
Wonderful, Jennifer. I think that these were excellent points, all of them, and very well taken and very useful feedback. And I think the last question is in fact an excellent question to be given to Mark van Heukelen, who of course is an important player in the foreign policy dimension of this. But Mark, let me also throw at you, since we have a lot of questions coming in already. Let me also throw at you two questions from our audience, which I'm sure you wanted to cover anyway, but let me still mention them. One is by Julian Schorb from DIHK. He's saying, well, how would a joint US-EU carbon border adjustment mechanism work if the US does not introduce any federal carbon pricing? US carbon tax or ETS remain unlikely even under Democrats. That was, I think, a point also Jennifer made. And Ruth Kiesinger is asking, well, since it's geopolitical here, does the insistence of the German government to adhere to Nord Stream 2, does it actually affect the European Green Deal? And if yes, what is the bigger impact and what is the geopolitical implications? Please, Mark.
Thank you, Guntram and the presenter Simone and Mark for a very stimulating paper. Lots of foods for thought. I'll make a few comments, and I hope that I can capture the two questions that you have put, at least the first one. The second one on Nord Stream, perhaps Stefano Grassi can say more on that. Let me make three comments, or three sorts of comments. But before doing so, let me point, as Jennifer has already done, to the conclusions that were adopted last week by the foreign affairs ministers, the 27, on climate and energy diplomacy. That's a 9-page document that addresses quite a number of the policy points that Mark reviewed, and that are on page 1 of your paper. So there are quite a number of things that I will not talk about, but where you might find answers in those 9 pages. Let me first make an analytical comment. Your paper indeed identifies the two most important geopolitical questions of the energy transition. One is, of course, the problem of the petrostates seeing their revenue drying up, and what to do about that. The other one is the question of the possible or the likely new dependence on critical raw materials for the new low carbon economy and what to do about them. But there are 3 other geopolitical aspects that perhaps are worth highlighting. The first is that in all likelihood, the energy transition is going to lead to a revision to existing military strategies and alliances that have been put in place to secure the international transport of oil and gas. Some hotspots of today, like the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca, are going to become much less important than they are today and they were in the past. And that may lead to a revision of military strategies and military effort. There are two other geopolitical issues to stress here. One is that the power deriving from fossil fuels in the past was largely a question of natural endowment, a gift of nature. You had it in the soil. The future power relationship is not going to be soil driven. That will be very much rooted in technological dominance. Exploiting that technological dominance and perhaps denying access to that technology may become a source of future conflict and a source of future power politics. Related to that is the question that the future energy systems will be very much based on smart grid digital solutions. So the low carbon energy will be very much a digitalized product. And that then raises important questions of geopolitics with regard to cybersecurity. So that's my first set of analytical comments. Now, on the issue of resource security, let me also make a few points there. They have been addressed in the Commission communication last autumn on critical raw materials. It's clear that we will depend on a number of raw materials that are really critical for renewable energy, be they lithium, cobalt, rare earth metals, platinum. We will be very dependent on them because the demand for those raw materials will rocket, not only in the European Union and the rest of the world. We're talking about 5 times, 20 times, 50 times from now to 2050. And we have to make sure that we have a response to that. Now, we know more or less what the recipe is to tackle the risk of foreign supply disruption. There are a number of internal things we need to do and a number of external things. On the internal side, 3 things come to mind. The first is the usual approach of an environmental nature, which is reduce, reuse, recycle. The lower the demand for fresh raw materials, the better it is in terms of reducing your dependence. Step up research and technology work into the availability of substitutes, and then explore the possibilities of those raw materials mining within Europe. Obviously, this mining may not be without problems itself, but we have to look into that. With regard to the external recipes, obviously we need to do what we did in the way for oil and gas, and that is to diversify our the portfolio of foreign suppliers of those raw materials, or as a matter of fact, skip those raw materials and go right away into the import of green electricity or hydrogen, and then establish a stable relationship with those exporting countries. Many of those countries are characterized by a pronounced role of the state in the economy, be it by way of state-owned enterprises, mining or processing licenses. So securing supplies cannot be left to European industry alone. That requires EU institutions and member states' governments to engage in an energy diplomacy to secure those raw materials. Third set of comments, and that then addresses your CBAM question, the Green Deal and the question it brings out with respect to international trade. CBAM will definitely be a delicate file to handle vis-a-vis third countries, because even when it is WTO compatible, and I'm confident that we can set up a scheme that is WTO compliant. I have some experience with that because I used to be in Geneva for a while. But even if it is WTO compliant, third countries may see it as a unilateral measure that extends the carbon constraint that we impose on our own producers to foreign producers. So definitely we will hear third countries saying this is blatant extraterritoriality. On the other hand, I think the world has moved on. There is an increasing number of foreign governments that is introducing themselves more stringent rules. And for them, the carbon leakage is an emerging concern as well. And that is what I think sets the CBAM apart from the episode we went through in 2012, 2014 with regard to international aviation, which is mentioned in your paper. The world has moved on. So we will be less isolated on CBAM than we were on international aviation. Now, ultimately, for the CBAM to gain international acceptance, I think that two matters will be important. The first is to demonstrate that CBAM has an environmental as distinct from an economic rationale. In other words, we do this because we aim to curb carbon emissions in Europe as well as abroad, rather than protect domestic industry from foreign competition. The second important matter is that there have to be incentives for third countries to step up their own climate action. Somehow CBAM should credit a third country's domestic climate measures. Otherwise, there's going to be the accusation of double taxation. Or put it differently, if a country has a climate policy that is as stringent as that of the EU, there is no carbon leakage danger and no carbon leakage to correct for, and therefore CBAM should not apply. Now, the CBAM raises, in a way, a number of more general issues. Various regulatory measures we are preparing in the context of the Green Deal bring up the general question of the interrelationship between trade and the international effects of environmental regulation. That's not new. We've been there before. I mean, those who have been following IUU fishing, those who have been following palm oil, know what I'm talking about. So we're now going to have a number of other files emerging in this trade and environment space. That may relate to deforestation in the world, that may relate to farm to fork, that may relate to methane emissions, that may relate to hydrogen standards. Several things can be mentioned. Now, all of these future regulations, I mean, don't get me wrong, all of these future regulations are in themselves very well taken, but they will have an impact on third countries. And that then raises the geopolitical question that I can put in provocative terms. For some, this will be seen as the EU being the new standard setter, which the rest of the world will follow. We will be the, say, the beacon on the hill. We will be the example to follow for the rest of the world. But for others, it will be different, and they will protest that this is regulatory unilateralism with an extraterritorial effect. And as has been said by Stefano and others as well, it's therefore going to be very important that we seek allies early in the process for these new measures, because otherwise our life will be, to put it in Chinese terms, interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark, for these very comprehensive and very pertinent comments. And I think the points you raised on carbon border adjustment mechanism are all well taken. In fact, Simone and I are finishing as we speak a paper in which we discuss these issues quite in detail. And one of the, I think, key issues indeed is that countries that have regulatory measures to contain and mitigate and reduce carbon emissions that are similarly strong than ours, I mean, cannot be subject to our carbon border adjustment mechanism. So in other words, I think the direction of travel needs to be one where countries that have similar degrees of ambition on reducing their emissions have to form some sort of a club where internally they agree on not leveraging carbon border adjustment on each other, while externally to third countries that are less ambitious, they have some form of a joint approach. And indeed, then the key question is, how do you compare an environmental regulation with an emission trading system with a CO2 tax. I mean, that has to be well established and has to be technically well defined. And so I think that is a very important discussion. We have a discussion actually tomorrow on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, more specifically here at Bruegel, with some scholars from the United States, and that will be led by Simone. And I think that's a good moment to go into more depth on this issue, but I think it's a very important issue. Now, unfortunately, we only have 3 minutes left to the hour. So let me just read 3 questions and then give the final word to Mark and Simone to react to those questions and react to what we've just heard. And so one question is from Jakob. You seem to assume that the EU 2030 and 2015 goals will be achieved. Do the EU global partners have the same assumption? Will they perhaps try to undermine EU efforts, or will the EU not achieve them? Then there is another question by Anonymous for gas. Do we know the schedule of yearly existing commitments for shipments from Russia, from Norway, etc.? And aren't we going to face bumpy negotiations ahead? There was also a question by Ronaldo Pinto, which we also discussed at some stage. He says, well, don't you think that the impact of a potential reduction in oil demand in Europe can be softened by a potential demand increase from developing and emerging economies? These are unfortunately just some of the questions. I could only ask 5 questions. You were kind enough to actually ask us 33 questions. That's a very high number, but it's impossible to ask 33. But I do think we capture here a nice variety of various questions that have come in. So let me give the floor to Mark perhaps first, and then Simone, and please 1 minute each, and then we finish on time. Mark, you are muted.
So thank you very much to everyone for asking the questions. Basically, this question about whether the EU will meet its targets or not, I'm not an expert on it, but I think that the 2 parts of the question I think are really interesting and are worth thinking about. One is, how do we do that and actually maintain the kind of internal dynamics which have been so difficult to get on the road? But secondly, how do we prepare for that pushback, which is definitely going to come in all sorts of different ways? And in a way, that's what our paper is about, is trying to map out some of the different dimensions on that. And I think part of that is going to be softening the impact on others, but we also have to be open-minded on that the winners and losers are not necessarily going to be the same people. So softening the impact doesn't necessarily mean that you can remove all the resistance. That's probably all I got time for, isn't it?
Well, you were quicker than 1 minute, so now Simone has a little bit more than 1 minute to react to also some of the issues we heard from our discussants.
Thank you very much. I would first like to focus on really this important issue that Stefano also highlighted, on the importance of linking the European Green Deal to industrial policy, and also to the willingness, we have to remember, of this commission to be a geopolitical commission. We really think, and I think the paper really outlines clearly, that this can be really an area in which these 3 different elements can be operationalized in a very pragmatic manner. Exporting the Green Deal, which is fundamental to have a global impact, given the fact that Europe only makes up to 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, is not only good for the climate and for our commitments under the Paris Agreement, also in terms of climate finance, which is very important, but is industrial policy. We really have scope here to push the European utilities and clean energy manufacturers to quickly rising emerging markets that are really eager for these kind of investments. So this is good for the world and for climate, but this is also good for our industry. And this is exactly what we need, particularly in this phase. And this is good for our foreign policy, because providing, for example, low carbon technologies to Africa means fostering the electrification of the continent, which is the fundamental prerequisite for its socio-economic development, which in the long run is a very important objective in foreign policy for the European Union. So maybe to conclude, let me also say that this year is particularly important. 2021 is going to be the year of climate. We know that in the run up to the COP26 in December, countries will have to present their new pledges. The EU already did its job, but now it's the turn of China, the US, and others. And really, the EU, together with the new US administration, can foster what we define as global coalitions for climate change that can really be a game changer in the global action against climate change. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I'm afraid that's all we have in terms of time for today. Thank you to all of our listeners, and thank you also to Stefano, Jennifer, and Mark for your excellent discussions of our paper. And thank you, Mark Lennart and Simone, for your presentation and for the great collaboration we've had on this project. It's been really fun, and I hope it will stimulate further debates in the coming weeks. So thank you all.